I was 9 years old when this happened. My parents lived in an old house on a quiet street in the countryside of Illinois. It was a Saturday afternoon, and my cousins had come to spend the weekend with us. We were bored and decided to play hide and seek inside the house because it was cold outside. My mother had warned us not to touch their room, but it was the best place to hide, full of large furniture, heavy curtains, and that huge dark wood closet that made noise when it opened. When it was my turn to hide, I ran straight there. I closed the door slowly and stayed in the dark, trying not to laugh. Inside, there was a smell of stored clothes, half sweet and stuffy. I could hear my cousins running down the corridor, yelling at each other, opening doors and tapping their feet on the floor. I tried to control my breathing so as not to make noise, but my heart was beating too loud. The only sound beyond that was the light creaking of the house, the kind of noise that every old house makes. After a while, the steps began to move away and everything became silent. I thought they had gone to look in another room. That's when I heard the sound of someone entering the room and closing the door very slowly. The sound of the door closing was so light that I almost didn't notice. I waited to hear someone laughing or calling my name, but nothing. Only the creak of the floor and then slow, dragged steps, going from one side of the room to the other. With each step, the floor squeaked differently, heavier than the sound of my cousins. I tried to peek through the crack in the closet doors, but inside it was too dark. For a moment, I thought it was my father trying to scare us. He loved to do that. Still, there was something strange in the way the person moved, as if he was undecided, stopping and turning the body suddenly. I was completely motionless, holding my breath. The steps approached until they were right in front of the closet. The sound stopped, and then came a whisper. Claire. Low, hoarse, as if the person had his mouth leaning against the wood. The sound was so clear that I was out of air. I knew the voice of my mother, my father, my cousins, and that was none of them. It was a different voice, dragged, almost out of air. I waited a few seconds without moving, my heart pounding, until I heard again a little closer. Claire, I know you're in there. My first reaction was to think it was one of my cousins trying to scare me, but the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. The game had started a few minutes ago, and no one there could sustain such a low and calm whisper. The voice didn't seem like a joke. He seemed to be waiting for an answer. I felt the floor vibrate slightly, as if the person had leaned against the door. The smell of old wood got stronger, and suddenly, I heard the dry sound of nails scraping outside the closet, very slowly, from top to bottom. That made me bite my lip so I wouldn't scream. I stood still, trying to hear any noise coming from the rest of the house, but the silence was absolute. The whisper came again, this time a little more distant. You can leave now. The voice seemed weaker, as if it was moving away from the room. I waited about 30 seconds, slowly opened the door crack and looked outside. The room was empty. The window closed, the light off, and the only thing that moved was the curtain, swinging with the wind of some crack. I left quickly, tripping over the blankets, and ran into the hallway screaming for my cousins. They came running from the room, laughing and asking why I was screaming. They said they were still counting, that no one had gone looking for me yet. I tried to explain what I heard, but the more I talked, the more they laughed, thinking I was making it up. I called my mother, still shaking, and asked her to check the room. She went there with me, turned on the light, opened the closet, and found nothing but the hanging clothes and some boxes. Even so, the air inside was hot, as if someone had been there a short time ago. She said it should be just my imagination and told us to play outside, but I knew what I had heard. I spent the rest of the day without being able to get that sound out of my head, that hoarse whisper saying my name. At night, when I was already in my pajamas, I heard my parents talking in the hallway. They thought I had read some horror story and scared me for noth. I lay down trying to sleep with the lamplight on, until I heard a creak coming from their room, the same sound of the closet door opening. I waited a few seconds and heard a light snap as if someone touched the wood, then total silence. Story 2. I must have been about 10 years old when this happened. It was a Saturday night, and my parents had invited some uncles and cousins to dinner. After everyone ate, we, the children, started playing hide and seek inside the house, while the adults talked in the kitchen. Our living room was large with a huge glass window that overlooked the backyard, and I thought the best hiding place was the corner behind the thick curtain, because you could see everything without being seen. The garden light was on, illuminating the lawn wet from the late afternoon rain, and the curtain left a crack that went straight to the window. I got stuck there and held my breath, laughing softly. Outside, the lights reflected on the glass and created that light mirror where I could see part of my face mixed with the backyard. That's when I noticed something strange. In the reflection next to my own silhouette, there was another figure standing still. A tall shadow motionless right outside, facing the window. At first I thought it was one of my cousins playing with me, but the body was wider and the shape of the head seemed covered by something. A hood, maybe. I was quiet, watching, waiting for him to move. But the figure stood there, standing still without taking a step. The distant sound of my cousin's laughter echoed through the house, and I felt my heart speed up. I tried to move the curtain away a little to see better, but when I moved the fabric, the reflection seemed to get closer to the glass. That made me retreat immediately, leaning against the back of the sofa. I could still see the silhouette even with the cloth covering part of the vision, high, straight, without any noticeable movement. I waited to hear some sound coming from the backyard, maybe footsteps or the gate opening, but everything was silent. That's when I realized something that gave me goosebumps. The figure seemed to be looking directly at me. Even though I knew the curtain was thick, I felt that whoever it was knew exactly where I was. I heard my cousin shout, "I found you," somewhere in the hallway, and I took the opportunity to get out of there as fast as I could. I ran to the kitchen, where my parents were, and told what I had seen. At first they laughed, thinking I was exaggerating because of the joke, but my mother noticed that I was pale and took it seriously. He called my father, who went to the living room with me. When we arrived, the curtain was still swaying slightly. The garden light was still on, illuminating the glass, and now there was nothing but my own reflection. Even so, the air seemed colder, and I swear I could still feel the presence of someone outside. My father opened the back door and left with the flashlight in his hand. I stood behind him, peeping through the stop with my heart beating on my neck. The lawn was damp. The air smelled of wet earth, and you could hear the light sound of water running down the gutter pipe. He lit up around the window, then the path that led to the gate. At first there didn't seem to be anything out of the ordinary, until the light passed through a darker point on the floor, footprint marks. They were clear, deep in the clay, starting very close to the living room window and going to half of the backyard, where they suddenly disappeared. My father looked at me with a frown, as if trying to find a logical explanation. He called my mother to see it too, and she got visibly nervous. He asked if any of the neighbors had passed there, but it was impossible. The back gate was always locked, and the padlock was still in place. The distance between the footprints was too great to be a child's, and the depth showed that whoever it was heavy, probably an adult. I remember standing at the door, watching the two trying to reason and only being able to think of one thing. The figure knew that I was behind the curtain. It didn't make sense, but it was the only explanation that came to my mind. My father decided to take a walk around the block, thinking that maybe some stranger had jumped the wall and run away. While he was leaving, my mother made me sit on the couch and tried to calm me down, saying that it must be just a shadow or the reflection of someone passing by on the street. But the living room window didn't overlook the street, and the backyard was surrounded by a high wooden wall. That made me even more confused. I stared at the glass, trying to convince myself that I hadn't seen what I saw, but the more I looked, the more it looked like there was a grease blur on the glass, exactly at the point where the figure's face had been. My father came back about 15 minutes later, saying he hadn't seen anyone. He walked to the gate, checked the lock, and confirmed that the padlock was intact, as if no one had left. Even so, he decided to leave the outside light on all night. When we went to sleep, you could still smell that smell of wet earth entering through the window. I lay down, but sleep didn't come. I kept my eyes open, remembering the shape of the figure standing in the reflection, and the way it seemed to move at the same moment I moved the curtain. It was as if he wasn't watching me from the outside, but on the other side of the glass, mirroring every movement. In the middle of the night, I woke up with a sound coming from the living room. It was a low snap like the wooden one creaking under weight. For a few seconds I stood still, trying to listen again, thinking it could be the wind. But the sound was repeated, this time accompanied by something softer, almost a scratch on the glass. I called my parents quietly, but neither of them answered. I got up the courage and went to the hallway, with my heart beating around my neck. The light in the living room was off, but the one in the garden still illuminated part of the curtain, and that's when I realized the fabric swayed slightly, as if someone had just moved it. I stopped in the middle of the corridor, not knowing if I should go forward or come back. The noise stopped and the silence filled everything again. Just the sound of the kitchen clock marking the seconds. When I took another step, the floor creaked, and at that moment the curtain moved again. A quick, abrupt movement, as if something had retreated from there. I screamed, calling my parents, and they came running. When my father turned on the light, the room was empty. We went straight to the window, and the blur I had seen before was still there, only sharper, like a hand mark pressed against the glass. My father opened the back door immediately and left with the flashlight, while my mother told me to stay behind her. The light illuminated the wet lawn, and for a moment it seemed that there was nothing different. But soon he called us to see. In the clay, right under the window, there were new footprints, deeper than the previous ones and now returning in the opposite direction, as if someone had been there again and walked away calmly. The strangest thing was the pattern. The marks suddenly stopped before reaching the gate, and from then on there was nothing else. No footprint, no mark on the floor, as if the person had disappeared from there. My mother insisted on coming in and locking everything, and that's what we did. I remember the sound of the key turning, the heavy silence that remained afterwards, and how the air seemed too cold inside the house. My father stayed up the rest of the night in the living room, looking out the window with the garden light on. I slept in my parents' room, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw again the reflection in the window. That figure standing still, motionless, as if he knew I was watching him. For years, I thought it was something in my head. But when we returned to visit the house many years later, the mark on the glass was still there, at the same point, the same size. Story 3. I must have been about 11 years old when it happened. It was my friend Evan's birthday, and the party was happening at his house, which was in a more remote area, near a forest. The place was big, old, with those heavy doors and wooden floor that creaked at every step. The house was full of children, cousins, neighbors, and schoolmates. After the congratulations and the games, we started playing hide and seek. It was his older sister's idea to let us use the basement, because no one would ever think of looking there. The basement was at the end of the kitchen corridor, behind a white door with an old metal lock. We went down in a group, laughing and pushing each other. The basement was cold, smelled of dust and humidity. There was a weak lamp hanging in the middle of the ceiling, which illuminated only the central part, leaving the corners immersed in the shade. There were stacked boxes, old toys, and furniture covered with sheets. One by one, we chose places to hide, behind a closet, under a table, behind boxes. The last one to come down was Kyle, one of the younger boys. As soon as he stepped on the last step, the door behind him slammed hard, and the sound of the metal lock was clear. The noise of the lock echoed through the basement, and the silence that followed was immediate. We were all looking at each other, a little confused, waiting for someone outside to open the door and say it was a joke. But no one answered. I ran up the steps and tried to turn the handle. Locked. I knocked a few times, calling for help, but the sound seemed muffled, as if the rest of the house had been too far away. When I returned to the center of the basement, the lamp started flashing. The wire swayed slightly, and the snap of the electric current sounded louder than our voices. Someone told us to be quiet and wait, that soon they would notice our lack. It was only a few minutes, but it seemed like hours. The air downstairs was heavy and cold. I remember the smell of dust mixed with moisture, and how my eyes burned with the dust suspended in the air. The lamp blinked once again and went out for good, leaving us in total darkness. One of the boys started laughing nervously, and another told him to shut up. Then came the sound, low, near the boxes in the corner, a soft, continuous laugh which didn't seem like any of us. It was different, a short, contained laugh, as if someone tried not to be heard. I asked who it was, but no one answered. The sound stopped for a second and then came closer. Everyone's first reaction was to think it was Kyle trying to scare us again, but he was by my side, shaking, holding my arm tightly. The sound of laughter came from a point where the lamp barely lit before going out, near some boxes covered by an old sheet. You could hear the breathing of all of us, fast and out of step, and yet the laughter seemed separate, distant. I called, "Who's there?" Just that muffled sound of someone trying to hold their breath. One of the boys took his cell phone to use the flashlight, but the screen didn't light up. Tried again, and nothing. He cursed softly and put the phone away. That's when we heard the scariest noise of the night, a dry drag like something heavy being pushed by the cement floor. The sound started at the bottom of the basement and was approaching slowly, interspersed with small pauses as if the thing would stop to hear where we were. No one spoke anymore. I felt my heart beating in my ears, the cold air entering hard through my lungs. The laughter came back, now much closer, almost on our side. It wasn't loud, but it was so clear that you could distinguish each breath between one laugh and another. The only thing I could do was squint my eyes and pray for the door to open soon. Suddenly something fell hard on the floor. It looked like a box or a chair. We all screamed at the same time. The sound of the wood hitting the concrete echoed loudly, and for a few seconds we couldn't hear anything but our own breathing. Then total silence. The kind of silence that makes your ears hurt. The darkness was so dense that it seemed like we were with our eyes closed. I felt the cold air on my face, and I swore I could hear the light sound of someone breathing too close right behind me. No one moved, no one spoke, until the door lock upstairs made a loud snap, and the lamp blinked, lighting up again. We all run at once. We went up the steps pushing each other, and Evan managed to open the door after turning the handle hard. When we left, the kitchen was lit, and the adults didn't even seem to know that we had disappeared. My parents came to ask why we were pale and sweating. We tried to explain, but everything sounded absurd, that someone was down there laughing with us in the dark. My father went down to check, thinking it was just a joke, but he didn't find anyone. Only the fallen boxes and shoe marks on the cement floor, more footprints than the number of children who were there. My father came up soon after, saying he hadn't seen anything abnormal. We were silent, exchanging glances. We knew he wasn't lying, but we also knew what we had heard. The laughter still echoed in the head of each of us, as real as the noise of the falling boxes. I remember looking at the basement stairs and having the feeling that the air there was different, colder, as if the place still kept the sound of what happened. No one wanted to play anymore after that. The adults tried to continue the party, but we all got together in the living room near the television without moving away from each other. Later, when everyone started to leave, I was still bothered. I went to the kitchen corridor and stared at the basement door. The light downstairs was still on, and the lamp oscillated slightly. I called my mother and asked if anyone had been there since we left, but she said no, that no one had even come close. When I looked again, the lamp went out by itself. That was enough for me to promise myself that I would never go down there again. The next day, Evan told me that his father had locked the basement with a padlock, and in the following weeks he said he heard noises of laughter coming from downstairs, always at dawn. Story 4. I must have been about 12 years old when this happened. My brother Nate was 2 years younger, and at that time we spent a lot of time playing in the garage. It was one of those autumn nights with fine rain falling all the time and the sound of the drops hitting the metal roof. My parents were in the living room watching TV, and the house was quiet. The garage was the place where we kept everything: bicycles, tools, and my father's car, a silver sedan that he never let us touch. But that night, we decided to play hide-and-seek right there just for a change. It was the only space in the house that had enough dim light to make everything more fun. I counted to 20 while he was looking for a place to hide. I could hear the sound of the boxes being moved, the creak of the floor, and the noise of the wind outside. When I finished counting and opened my eyes, the garage was silent. I passed the flashlight behind the shelves under the bench behind the warehouse door, but I saw no sign of it. That's when I heard a muffled sound coming from inside the car, the noise of something beating lightly twice, followed by a short laugh. I approached and realized that it came from the trunk. I sighed and said I had already found it, but the noise suddenly stopped. I called his name and nothing. I waited a few seconds and hit the bodywork, thinking he was trying to scare me. The silence inside began to make me uncomfortable. I went to the driver's seat and pulled the lever to open the trunk, but nothing happened. It seemed locked. Then I heard the sound of something scraping inside, as if he was moving slowly. I hit him again, harder, and told him to stop joking. No answer. The rain outside increased and the noise echoed in the metal structure of the garage. I stood there trying to hear anything other than the rain, and that's when I noticed the most subtle sound of all. The garage door began to move. It was a long, heavy creak, the kind of sound the engine makes when someone presses the remote control to open. I looked at the wall where the control was always hanging. It was in the same place. No light came on the dashboard, and I knew my parents were in the room, too far away to hear. The wind that came in through the crack made the leaves on the ground spread. I ran to the car and tried to open the trunk manually, pulling with all my strength, but it was locked in a strange way, as if something was holding it inside. The sound of the door continued, rising little by little, and the cold wind began to enter hard. That's when I heard my brother, inside the car, whispering my name very softly. Eli. There's someone here. The way he said my name left me paralyzed. His voice didn't sound like a joke, it was low, trembling, as if he was afraid to breathe loudly. I spent a few seconds trying to understand what he meant, and it was at that interval that the noise of the door motor suddenly stopped, leaving only the sound of the rain beating outside. The cold wind entered through the incomplete opening, and the shadows moved on the wall, projected by the light of the street poles. I looked quickly at the opening of the garage, and I swear I saw something dark moving outside, an indefinite, high form, stopped for a few seconds before disappearing into the darkness. I ran back to the car and told him to get out of there, but the trunk wouldn't open at all. He started beating inside, desperate, asking me to take him out. With each blow, I felt the vibration in the bodywork and the muffled sound of his voice, almost crying. I took the garage control and tried to close the door, but the button didn't respond. Just a dry click and nothing. The wind increased, and the noise of the metal hitting made the sound echo throughout the room. I screamed, calling my father, and at that moment, something fell hard in front of the car, as if someone had knocked over one of the big boxes. It was enough to make me retreat. The box rolled until it hit the front wheel. The noise made my heart race. I approached slowly, trying to see what had fallen, and realized that it was not a box, but my father's old tool bag, the one that was locked on the top shelf. It was open, the tools scattered on the floor as if someone had thrown it from up there. I looked at the corner of the garage and saw the aluminum ladder leaning against the place, but no movement. The sound of the wind came from the opening of the door, which now swayed a few centimeters up and down, creaking with each oscillation. The rain was beating hard, and the smell of wet earth invaded the air. I heard my brother hit again, harder, and the sound of him crying. I went to the car and tried to unlock the trunk by the spare key that was on the dashboard, but the button was loose, broken. My body began to tremble, and not only with fear. The cold inside was cutting. Then I heard footsteps. 3, maybe 4 slow steps on the concrete floor, coming from the direction of the partially open door. The sound was light but defined, like wet shoes dragging. I stood still, unable to move, with my gaze fixed on the crack illuminated by the pole. For a second, I saw the shadow of a foot. Then, nothing. The footsteps echoed slowly, one after the other, and their sound made the air in the garage seem colder. I didn't know if I should run inside the house or try to open the trunk anyway. I tilted my body a little, and through the opening of the door I saw the contour of something dark on the outside. I couldn't see it right. The pole light oscillated with the rain. But I swear I saw a standing silhouette, motionless, facing the garage. A thunder broke out, and at that moment, the shadow disappeared. I heard my brother crying softly again, saying that he had heard someone walking in there with him. That was enough to make me scream for help. My father came running in seconds with a flashlight and a scared expression. His light cut the dark of the garage, and as soon as he entered, the door motor moved by itself, closing completely. The noise was so loud that the sound echoed to the kitchen. I pointed to the car, shouting that Nate was stuck. My father came to the trunk and pulled it at once. The lid opened as if it had never stopped. My brother came out of there white, panting, and grabbed his arm. He said that while he was imprisoned, he had heard someone breathing near his face, and that the sound came from inside the car. My father looked inside the trunk and saw nothing but the emergency blankets and the stirpe. He passed the flashlight through every corner, then through the garage floor, but there was no one. The wind was still buzzing outside, and every time the rain hit the metal door, the sound seemed louder. When he went to the panel to turn off the automatic garage system, the control that was attached to the wall was no longer there. We kept looking, and we only found the device fallen outside near the entrance, soaked and covered in clay, as if someone had thrown it from inside. After we locked everything, we went up to the house. My parents tried to make us calm down, but Nate and I couldn't sleep. Every time the wind rocked a window, we held our breath. The next morning, when we went to the garage with my father to check, the control was still in the same place where he had left it, clean, dry, as if it had never fallen into the mud. And the strangest thing, there were footprints on the floor, only 2 going from the side of the car to the door. The floor mat was too big to be a child's, and the marks stopped right on the edge, as if the person had left and disappeared in the middle of the rain. Story 5. I must have been about 10 years old when my parents decided to spend the summer in a country house we had rented in the countryside of Maine. The house was old, with dark wooden floors and a constant smell of mold mixed with dust. It was isolated, surrounded by tall trees and an open field that was completely silent at night. Me, my younger sister, and 2 cousins tried to find things to do all day, and we ended up discovering the attic in the first week. It was a large space full of boxes, old toys, and thick fabric curtains covering the windows. The place seemed perfect to play hide and seek. We all went up excited, pushing the wooden ladder that led to the door. The light of the late afternoon entered through the cracks of the windows, letting the dust shine in the air. Everyone started looking for a place to hide, and I found mine quickly, behind an old curtain near the back wall. The fabric was rough and smelled of moisture, but it hid it well. I could see a little through the torn seam. You could see the stairs and part of the floor. I heard my sister telling me out loud downstairs, and I shrank so as not to make noise. After a few seconds, you could only hear the sound of the house, the crashing of the floor and the wind outside. The dust rose in the air every time we moved. I hid behind the curtain trying not to sneeze, and I heard my cousins laughing on the other side of the attic. The game seemed simple. Someone counted downstairs and the others hid upstairs. The wood creaked with each step, and the sound echoed through the ceiling as if there were more people up there than there really were. I was quiet, breathing slowly, and little by little the noise of laughter was disappearing. You could only hear the wind beating on the window and the light smee of the curtain. For a moment I thought I heard footsteps on the stairs, but no one said anything. Through the space between the fabric and the wall I saw a shadow move. I thought it was one of my cousins coming up to look for it, so I held my breath and waited. The steps approached, but they were slow, heavy, different from those of a child. It seemed that every step sank the wooden floor. The sound stopped right in front of the curtain. I couldn't see who it was, only the tips of the dark shoes appearing through the lower crack. I was waiting for someone to say my name, laugh, make any noise, but what came was a snap, like an articulation, followed by a long and deep breath. My whole body got stiff. I wanted to get out of there, but my legs just didn't respond. The breathing on the other side was slow, rhythmic, almost panting, as if the person was tired. For a moment, I thought it was my father. Maybe he had gone up to see what we were doing. But the steps were different, heavier, and the sound came from a point where the floor did not usually creak. The curtain moved slightly as if someone had touched it. I felt the fabric touch my arm and froze. The touch was light, but enough for me to step back and bump into the wall. The noise seemed to scare the thing on the other side because the steps moved again, only this time faster, going in the direction of the stairs. I pulled the curtain and ran away. When I looked, there was no one there. The door was open, the stairs still swinging, and downstairs you could hear my sister and my cousins laughing with no idea what was happening. I shouted their name and everyone went up, thinking I was joking. I told them what I heard, but they didn't believe me. They laughed and said that I should have heard the noise of the wind or the rats. Even so, None of them wanted to hide in that corner afterwards. The air in the attic was still, heavy. The wood creaked with every step my cousins took, and the light that came from the window was already starting to disappear with the sunset. I was still panting, trying to convince myself that I had imagined everything. We decided to continue the game, but no one wanted to hide alone. We all stayed together for a while, looking towards the curtain. With each breath of wind, the fabric swayed as if someone was behind. I tried to laugh and say that it was just the air entering through the cracks, but the knot in my stomach wouldn't let me. The light started to fail, and my sister suggested we go down. The moment she said that, the sound of footsteps came back. Heavy, measured, now coming from the opposite side of the attic, near the covered windows. The floor vibrated slightly with each step. We all stood still, exchanging glances without the courage to speak. The stairs that led downstairs creaked as if someone had just gone up, but we were all upstairs. I felt the curtain move once again, the fabric inflating and then touching my shoulder. I screamed and ran to the middle of the room. My cousins did the same, and the sound of footsteps stopped instantly, leaving only the sound of our breathing and the wind outside. My older cousin tried to pretend calm, saying that we should be listening to the sound of the wood dilating with the cold, but even he trembled when he spoke. We went together to the curtain to prove that there was nothing there. When we pulled the fabric, we saw only the wall and the floor covered with dust, but there were fresh footprints as if someone had walked barefoot there a few seconds ago. They went to the middle of the room and stopped out of nowhere. No return, no continuity. We kept looking, trying to find an explanation. The air was cold, and the smell of mold had mixed with that of something metallic, like rust. We ran down, almost stumbling on the stairs, and we told everything to the adults. My father went up to check, thinking that we had confused noise with imagination. We waited in the living room, listening to the sound of his footsteps upstairs. After a few minutes, he came back saying that there was no one, but commented that he found it strange that one of the attic windows was open, even with the cold wind. He assured that he had closed them all when we arrived. That night, we all slept in the same room, and it took me hours to close my eyes. Before going to sleep, I swore I heard from afar the sound of the curtain swinging up there, even without wind. Story 6. I must have been about 10 years old at that time, and we lived in a single-story house in the countryside of Pennsylvania. It was an old house, with narrow corridors and a floor that creaked all the time. One rainy autumn night, my older brother Eli and I were bored and started playing hide-and-seek inside the house. Our parents had already gone to sleep, so we kept the lights down so as not to wake them up. The house was illuminated only by the yellowish light in the kitchen and the television in the living room, which was still on at low volume. I was responsible for telling, and Eli ran around the rooms looking for a place to hide. When I finished counting, I started looking for him in silence. I went first to the living room, then to the bedrooms, but I couldn't find it. That's when I noticed the corridor that connected the kitchen to the back room. A narrow, long space with dark wooden floors and only a small window at the end. It was the kind of place that always seemed darker than the rest of the house, even with the lights on. I thought he could be there, so I walked slowly, trying not to make noise. In the middle of the corridor, I noticed a shadow movement on the floor, very close to the wall. I thought it was him, and I stopped. But then I noticed something strange. The shadow was too high to be my brother's. I stood completely still, looking at that dark shape projected on the floor. She moved slowly, as if someone was walking on the opposite side towards me. The problem is that because of the reflection of the kitchen light, you could clearly see that there was no one in the hallway, only the shadow growing with every step. I felt the air in the environment change, get colder. The sound of my heartbeat seemed to echo inside my head. I called Eli's name, but he didn't answer. Instead, I heard the sound of the floor creaking, coming from a few meters ahead, and soon after, the shadow lengthened, almost touching my feet. I took a step back and felt the cold wall in my back. The whole house was silent for a few seconds, and I had the impression that the air was being sucked out of the hallway. The kitchen light flashed once, and when it returned, the shadow had disappeared. I ran to the other side, screaming for my brother. I found him leaving my parents' room with a confused expression, asking why I was so pale. I could only tell that someone was in the hallway with me. He laughed, thinking it was another one of my paranoia, and said he was counting on the other side of the house all this time. But I knew what I had seen, and what I heard didn't seem like a joke. Even after he said he hadn't left our parents' room, I was still with my body locked. The feeling that someone was still there didn't go away. I went to the entrance of the corridor and stood still, trying to find some explanation. The kitchen lamp swayed slightly with the wind, casting shadows on the walls, but none of them moved like the one I had seen. I approached slowly, one step at a time, until I was at the same point where the shadow had stopped. The floor was cold and the air seemed different, denser. I heard a loud and dry snap coming from the ceiling as if something had moved up there. I called my brother again and he came with a flashlight in his hand, still half laughing in my face. When the light reached the end of the corridor, we saw something that made the two stop. The small window curtain was swinging inward even with the glass closed. The wood of the stop was clashing and the cold wind seemed to come from inside, not from outside. Eli went there and pushed the curtain with his fingertips, revealing the glass completely closed and a thin layer of condensation inside. In the middle of the glass, a mark, something that looked like a hand, small but elongated, as if someone had pressed the glass a short time ago. We stared at that brand for a few seconds without saying anything. It didn't look like dirt or dust. It was a wet, recent mark, and you could even see the contour of the fingers. Eli passed his arm on the window to clean, but the cloth came back dry as if there was nothing there. He tried to laugh, saying that I had probably stopped before without realizing it, but I hadn't even come close to that part of the house. While he was talking, a low noise cut the air, a creak coming from somewhere behind us in the middle of the corridor. We turned at the same time. The light of the flashlight swayed, projecting our shadows on the wall, but there was another one, bigger, motionless, right in the center of the floor. She didn't come from us, and she was standing still, as if something blocked the light that came from the kitchen. My brother took a step forward, and the shadow moved too, slowly, as if retreating a little. At that moment, the flashlight flashed and went out. The corridor plunged into total darkness. I felt Eli's hand pull me, and we started running towards the kitchen. The sound of our steps mixed with another, that of heavier steps behind us, as if someone followed us, stepping firmly closer and closer. We entered the kitchen and turned on all the lights, turning backwards at the same time. The corridor was empty. No shadow, no sound, just the echo of our breath. My brother tried to laugh to disguise his nervousness, but you could see in his eyes that he was scared. We stayed a few minutes in the kitchen looking at the hallway, waiting to see anything move. Nothing happened. The rain outside hit the windows and the wind made the ceiling snap. Little by little, the silence returned. I said I wanted to call our parents, but Eli insisted no, that they were going to fight with us for being up so late. He went to the beginning of the corridor to prove that there was nothing there. He stood still for a few seconds, took a deep breath, and turned on the flashlight again. "See? It's okay," he said, but his voice trembled. When he turned to come back, the light of the flashlight passed through the wall and revealed something that made me freeze. There was a shadow there, standing still, taller than him, projected in the corner, but there was nothing to create it. I pointed, trying to warn, and at that very moment the light flashed and the shadow disappeared. Eli ran back to the kitchen and we both stood still without saying a word. We stayed there until the sound of the rain subsided. Before going to sleep, he locked the bedroom door and left the lamplight on. None of us could nail our eyes. And to this day, when I remember that night, what gives me goosebumps the most is not the shadow. It's the sound of the steps behind us, heavy, firm, as if they knew exactly where to step. Story 7. I must have been about 11 years old when this happened. It was a summer night and I was sleeping at my best friend's house, Sophie. Her parents had had a barbecue, and after the adults went to sleep, we, the children, decided to stay awake playing hide and seek. The house was big, with long corridors and several rooms, the kind of place that looks even bigger when the lights are off. It was past 11, and the only illuminated room was the living room, where we left a flashlight on to serve as a base. The rest of the house was immersed in that bluish gloom of the external lights entering through the windows. In my turn to hide, I decided to go to the guest room, because no one used to enter there. The room smelled of stored sheets and old furniture. As soon as I entered, I realized that the bed was high enough to fit underneath. I bent down and slid inside, trying not to make noise. The quilt hung to the floor, covering almost everything. Down there, I could only see the carpet and the contour of the bed feet. I heard Sophie's voice counting in the living room, each number echoing through the house. The sound of her and other friends' footsteps spreading made me hold my breath. I felt confident that no one would find me there. The minutes went by and the house fell silent. The kind of silence in which even the sound of one's own heart seems too loud. I heard from time to time the floor creaking, some distant muffled laughter, and then nothing. I must have been there for about 5 minutes when I noticed a very close sound, slow steps coming down the corridor, each of them making the wooden floor snap. I was completely motionless. The doorknob turned slowly, and the guest room door opened with a creak. I saw the shadow of the corridor light projecting across the carpet, and then a pair of bare feet stopping right next to the bed. The feet were there, less than a meter from me. You could see the curve of the heel, the dark dirt under the nails, the way the fingers moved lightly, as if the person was impatient. The first thing I thought was that it was one of my friends trying to find me, but something bothered me immediately. The feet were too big. They looked like an adult. I held my breath and waited for the person to bend down, look under the bed, do anything, but she didn't move. She just stood there, motionless, for too long. I tried to hear any sound that indicated who it was, but the room was completely quiet. No audible breathing, no movement other than a slight creak of the floor, as if the person were transferring the weight from one foot to the other. I felt a chill go up my spine, and instinctively I took my hand to my mouth so as not to make noise. The position was uncomfortable, and the carpet smelled of mold. I counted the seconds, waiting for the moment when someone would lift the quilt and laugh, saying they had found me. But that never happened. The person stayed there for so long that I started to lose track of time. When I finally decided to look, I turned my face slowly and lifted the quilt with 2 fingers, just enough to see the room. The lights were off, and the person's silhouette stood out only by the faint light of the corridor. It looked like someone standing still with his back to me, motionless. What made me more confused is that the person was completely quiet, as if he heard. Then, suddenly, I heard the voices of my friends outside the house, calling my name. They were in the backyard, laughing and screaming for me to show up. The sound clearly came from the street. My whole body froze. If everyone was outside, who was standing inside the room with me? For a few seconds, I couldn't even breathe. The feet were still next to the bed, and the silence was so heavy that I heard the noise of my heart beating inside my ear. I knew I wasn't one of the girls. The way the person was standing still was wrong. My friends were still shouting my name outside, and their sound sounded distant, muffled, as if there was a thick wall separating the room from the rest of the house. I held back the crying, trying not to make any sound, but the air seemed to be stuck in my throat. Then slowly the feet began to move. First a step, then another. Slowly they moved away until they stopped at the door. I could hear the slight creak of the hinges when the door opened a little more. The light in the corridor went out, and the only thing left was the bluish gloom entering through the window. I waited 1 more minute, and when I finally got up the courage, I went out from under the bed. The room was completely empty. The door was open and the corridor was dark. When I ran down the stairs and found the group outside, they were all there. No one had gone back inside since the beginning of the game. I told what had happened, but no one believed it. Sophie thought I had dreamed down there, and the other girls laughed, saying that I should have confused the noise of my own feet. I insisted that I had seen someone, that the feet were big, that the person stood there for a long time. But the more I talked, the more I realized that none of them were lying. Everyone had stayed outside the whole time. That night, I asked to sleep in the living room. And to this day, I remember the feeling that someone was still inside the house, watching us through the windows. The next morning, Sophie's parents found the back door ajar. There were no signs of breaking in, only the latch raised inside. Her father thought that some of us must have forgotten to close, but when we went to look at the guest room, the carpet near the bed was marked. 2 pairs of footprints, one of them small, mine, and another much larger, with the sharp design of a wet heel. They tried to laugh, saying it must be some coincidence, but I could never believe it. And to this day, every time I sleep in a room with a very high bed, I looked down before turning off the light. Always. Story 8. I must have been about 13 years old when this happened. It was the end of summer, and me and my two friends, Mark and Jason, spent the afternoons playing on the block where we lived. Our houses were side by side, separated only by low wooden fences. That night started like any other, playing ball in the backyard until dark. When the street light came on, we decided to continue the game, but now hide and seek. The plan was to hide between the backyards without leaving the street, but the game ended up going too far. Mark was the first to count, and I ran towards the back of my backyard. The wind brought the smell of wet grass and the distant sound of a barking dog. I jumped the fence and ended up in the backyard of the neighbor, Mr. Harris, an elderly man who lived alone. He had traveled for about 2 weeks and the house was completely erased. I was just going to bend down behind the garage, but I saw that the back door was ajar. I found it strange because he was careful with everything. I stood still for a few seconds, looking at the dark inside, and I ended up entering. As soon as I stepped into the kitchen, I noticed the smell of old wood and dust. Everything was in absolute silence, except for the sound of the rain beating weakly on the windows. The clock on the wall marked almost 9 at night. The street light passed through the thin curtains, creating bluish stripes on the floor. The place looked exactly as Mr. Harris had left it. A cup on the table, a jacket hanging from the chair, and the radio turned off. I should have come back, but the atmosphere of the game made me continue. I decided to go up the stairs, thinking it would be funny to hide inside and see their reaction when they didn't find me. The upstairs corridor was narrow, covered with carpet, and smelled of mold. I found a room with the door ajar and went in. In the corner, there was a large closet, one of those old ones with a sliding door. I opened just enough to get in, and I shrank in there, trying not to make noise. Outside, the sound of the rain seemed distant, muffled by the walls. I stood there in the dark, with my heart racing, listening to the occasional noise of the wind. A few minutes passed. No sound of footsteps, no call from my friends. I was starting to think the game was over when I heard slow steps up the stairs. The sound was clear, the creak of the steps being pressed one at a time. It didn't sound like the sound of a child running, it was heavier, rhythmic, like that of an adult walking slowly. I froze. I expected to hear Mark or Jason's voices, but nothing. Just the steps going up to the top of the stairs and stopping. The silence that followed was so complete that you could hear the ticking of the clock downstairs. I leaned over to try to look through the crack in the closet door, but I only saw a strip of light crossing the bedroom floor. And then, the shadow. A dark contour projected on the carpet, coming from the direction of the corridor. The shadow stopped right in front of the room. I got my whole body stuck. The sound of slow breathing filled the environment so low that it seemed to come from all sides. I tried to convince myself that it was just one of my friends trying to scare me, but the way that figure moved was no joke. It was careful, slow, almost hesitant. The doorknob turned a little, and the metallic sound echoed in the room. The door opened a few centimeters, and I could see a part of the wall illuminated by the corridor light. No movement, no words. Just that slight creak of the floor, as if someone had taken a step inside. My heart was beating so fast that I feared that the sound would betray me. The shadow moved a little more, and now you could clearly see that someone was there. The feet, covered by dark socks, stopped a few meters from the closet. I held my breath. The sound of the rain outside seemed to have completely disappeared, as if the whole world had been silent. The figure stood still for a time that seemed endless. I felt the air inside the closet getting hotter and hotter, and a strong smell of wet wood made me want to cough. Suddenly, the person took another step, and the corridor light illuminated part of the leg and hand. It was a pale, thin hand, with protruding veins, which moved slowly on the closet handle. I closed my eyes tightly and held my breath, waiting for the door to open, but instead the figure stopped. He stayed there, breathing close, doing nothing else. After a few seconds, he retreated. The sound of footsteps returned, now going down the stairs more and more distant until it disappeared completely. Only then did I release the air. I stayed inside the closet for a long time, trying to understand what had just happened. My legs were shaking, and I still couldn't convince my head to get out of there. I waited to hear any noise coming from downstairs. A voice, a door, something. But the house was completely silent again. The clock kept marking the time, each tick echoing too loudly in the corridor. I got up the courage and opened the door slowly. The runner, too. I approached the stairs and looked down. The kitchen lights were still off, but the back door swayed, opening and closing with the wind. I went down slowly, feeling the cold floor under my bare feet. When I got to the kitchen, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. The carpet near the door was wet, and there were footprints going from the entrance to the beginning of the stairs. Big marks, from someone wearing soaked socks. None of my friends would have entered like that, even more so knowing that the neighbor was not at home. I ran outside without looking back, jumped the fence and went straight to Mark's backyard. They were there, laughing, saying that they had stopped the game because they couldn't find me anymore. When I told what happened, their laughter ended on the spot. They stared at me without saying anything for a few seconds, trying to understand if I was joking. I swore I didn't. I had seen someone inside the house and heard the footsteps on the stairs. Mark told me that Mr. Harris was still out of town. He had seen his car parked at the station that morning before going fishing with his father. Jason suggested that it was some invader, but no one wanted to go back there to check it out. We stayed on the other side of the fence looking at the dark house. The windows reflected the streetlight and nothing moved inside. After a few minutes, the light upstairs turned on by itself. The three of us saw it. None of us moved. The bedroom curtain opened a little as if someone had looked inside and then closed slowly. We ran into Mark's house and told his father everything. He went there with a flashlight and made us wait on the balcony. He came back about 15 minutes later, saying that there was no one, and that all the doors were locked, including the back one. I wanted to insist, but he said that probably one of us had turned on the light by mistake. Even so, that night no one slept well, and when Mr. Harris returned from the trip, he said he found the house exactly as he had left it, with one exception. The kitchen carpet, according to him, was still damp. Story 9. I must have been about 9 years old when my parents decided to move to another city. That week, the house was full of boxes stacked everywhere, and the basement looked like a maze. I remember it was a stuffy summer afternoon, and my mother asked me to stay around while she finished organizing everything. My brother and I invented to play hide and seek among the piles of boxes, because the rest of the house was already almost empty. The basement had a dim light, which blinked sometimes, and a smell of wet wood mixed with dust. Those piles of cardboard made strange sounds when we bumped into them. In my turn to hide, I chose the darkest corner, where the boxes were higher. I dragged one forward and stuck behind, trying not to drop anything. You could hear my brother walking upstairs on the main floor, still counting. I stood there, quiet, waiting for him to come down. After a while, everything was silent. You could only hear the distant sound of the refrigerator engine and from time to time the snap of the wooden floor. That's when I heard a noise very close, something being dragged on the basement floor, slowly scraping the concrete. The sound was continuous, heavy, as if someone was pushing a large box with both hands. I thought it was my brother trying to find me, so I was quiet not to hand over the hiding place. But the noise didn't come from the stairs or the side where he would enter. It came from the back of the basement, from the part where there wasn't even light. I could clearly hear the sound of cardboard scraping on the floor, then a pause and more dragging closer. I waited to hear his footsteps soon after, but nothing. Only that sound getting closer and closer. I felt my heart speed up. I took a deep breath and screamed, "I found you!" The noise stopped at the same time. The silence that came later was so absolute that I came to think I had imagined everything. I waited a few seconds and left behind the boxes, laughing a little nervously. But the basement was completely empty. I looked around, between the batteries, even behind the bigger boxes, and there was no one. I called my brother's name, but he didn't answer. I went to the stairs to go up, and before putting my foot on the first step, I heard another sound. The same drag from before, only coming again from the back, from the same dark point where the lamps did not reach. The sound was now faster, as if the box was being pushed hard. I ran back a few steps and stared into the dark, trying to see any movement. The lamp flashed once, and for a moment, I found to see a shadow moving between the boxes. It seemed low, curved, but disappeared as soon as the light stabilized. My stomach gave a knot. I went up the stairs running and screaming for my brother, but he appeared coming from the backyard, sweating and with a ball in his hand. He said he hadn't even entered the basement yet. I stood at the door not knowing what to answer. My mother heard the screaming and went downstairs asking what was happening. I told her that I had heard someone downstairs dragging the boxes, and she looked around quickly, thinking it was a cat or the wind coming in through some open window. We went back to the basement together. The place was the same, only that one of the piles of boxes had changed position. It didn't seem to have fallen. It was as if someone had pushed an entire group a few centimeters to the side. My mother frowned but didn't say anything. He just told us to get out of there and lock the door. That night, the change continued as if nothing had happened, but I couldn't get it out of my head. The image of the boxes slightly out of place did not leave my mind. When the sun went down, my father went down to get some tools and then commented that the air downstairs was stuffy, with a strong smell of wet paper, as if someone had moved the batteries recently. He thought it was a humidity thing and left the door open to ventilate. I tried to avoid passing by, but every time I crossed the corridor, I seemed to hear the weak sound of something scraping again, right down there. Before going to sleep, my mother came into my room and asked why I had screamed earlier. I told her everything again, and she insisted that there was no one. When I turned to lie down, I heard a distant noise coming from the basement, a snap, followed by something scratching the floor. She heard too because she was silent for a few seconds and then said, trying to look calm, that it must be the cardboard swelling with the moisture. The next day, while the porters were removing the last boxes, one of them asked if anyone had slept in the basement. He said that some boxes had drag marks on the floor, as if they had been moved several times during the night. Story 10. I must have been about 10 years old when my parents and the parents of two friends decided to rent a vacation home in the countryside of Vermont. It was an old house made of wood with the smell of a fireplace and windows that shook when the wind beat. The owner had left several old furniture and toys stored in one of the upstairs rooms, and we loved to explore that. There were rag dolls, tin carts, and even a rocking horse that creaked when someone touched it. One rainy night after dinner, we decided to play hide and seek right there, because the adults were in the living room and the rest of the house was too dark. We turned off some of the lights to make it more difficult and started the game. I ran out with the other two boys, trying to find a good place to hide. The toy room looked perfect. The large dark wood closet was full of boxes and stacked dolls, and had a space at the bottom that could fit crouched. I went in quickly, closed the door slowly, and shrank inside. The smell was of dust and old wood, and the sound of the rain hitting the roof made everything more stuffy. I heard the noise of their footsteps passing through the corridor, then my friend's voice telling me on the other side of the house. The interior of the closet was almost completely dark. Only a crack of light passed through the small openings of the doors. I could see the outline of the boxes and the erased glow of the glass eyes of some old dolls. They seemed to stare at me, motionless. I was as quiet as possible, holding my breath. The floor of the house creaked with each step of the other children, and the sound mixed with the noise of rain and wind. A few minutes passed and the sounds began to decrease. No voice, no step. Only the occasional ratting of the wood and the rattling of the wind against the windows. Suddenly, I felt a light touch on my shoulder. Cold, fast, as if someone had touched with their fingertips. I turned around instinctively, but I hit my elbow on a box and made noise. I waited for someone to laugh, but nothing happened. I stood still, with my heart racing, trying to convince myself that I should have touched some toy. But the space in there was tight. I knew exactly where the boxes were, and there was nothing behind me. I was about to open the door and leave when I heard very close to the ear a short and thin laugh. It sounded like a child's, but the sound came from inside the closet, not from outside. The sound was so clear that I froze. It was a short, muffled laugh, as if someone was trying not to be heard. For a second, I thought it was one of my friends playing a trick on me. But the voice was different, higher, and seemed to come from the bottom of the closet behind the boxes. I tried to speak, but my throat stuck. I stretched out my hand slowly, groping the dark, and felt only the cold wood of the wall. The silence suddenly returned, and the only thing I could hear was the rain on the roof and the irregular sound of my breathing. I opened the door a little to let in a beam of light, and for a moment I thought I saw something moving in the background. A quick glow, like the reflection of a doll's eyes. I pushed the boxes to the side and heard a dry snap, as if something had fallen deeper. I couldn't stand it. I pushed the door for good and stumbled out, almost falling to the ground. When I looked back, the boxes that were stacked had changed position, and one of them was open. Inside, there was a small cloth doll with a dirty face and a sewn smile. The closet door swayed by itself, making a low creak that sounded like a whisper. My friends showed up seconds later, scared by the noise. They asked why I had screamed, but I couldn't answer properly. I pointed to the closet and said someone was inside. They laughed, thinking I had been scared by the old toys, but when one of them went there to try it, the smile disappeared. The closet was completely empty. The boxes were out of place, and the cloth doll I had seen now was lying on the floor, face down. The wind that came in through the window made the curtain move slowly, and the sound of the rain seemed louder, hitting the roof and echoing through the room. We stared at the doll for a few seconds until he began to slide slightly, as if someone had pushed him with his foot. No one moved. I swear I saw him spin a little, very slowly, before stopping again. At that moment, a loud thunder made the light flash, and we all ran out of the room. When the adults came to see what was happening, the room was already dark, and the closet closed. They tried to open it, but the door seemed locked, as if something was pushing inside. The next day in the morning, the closet was unlocked, and completely empty. No box, no toy.
Thank you for staying until the end of this video. It's amazing to have you here accompanying me until the end of the stories. If you liked it, leave your comment telling what was the story that moved you the most. And if you are not yet registered, sign up so you don't miss the next ones. Until next night of scary stories.